Welcome back. Today we're looking at a discussion guide about Erica Kirk's forgiveness message after her husband Charlie's assassination. It's really complex stuff, powerful reactions all around. Let's dive right in on how to sharpen this analysis.
Yeah, it starts with that forgiveness moment, which, definitely got a lot of attention. But looking deeper, the real story, the richer discussion, seems to be less about just forgiveness itself and more about, well, the conflict around it.
Right. Okay, so that feels like our first big opportunity here. The central tension between forgiveness and political retribution need deeper exploration.
Exactly. The guide, as it is now, kind of focuses on I forgive him as this, standalone act of grace. Powerful, yes, but it pulls it away from everything else happening at that same service. Specifically, the political counter messages.
Okay, but wasn't that moment the big headline, the thing everyone talked about? Why deliberately shift away from that moment of grace?
Because isolating it, you kind of miss the core fight, the real tension of the event. The prompt asks about the power of forgiveness, right? But the sources, they show forgiveness immediately getting pushed up against calls for, well, antagonism, vengeance even.
Ah, so it wasn't just faith operating in a vacuum?
Not at all. It's about how faith and political mobilization were tangled together right there, making it almost impossible to separate them in that moment.
Got it. So the suggestion is really to reframe things. Focus the main question on that clash. The competing signals being sent.
Precisely. Instead of just analyzing forgiveness, the guide should analyze how that reconciliation language was used, maybe strategically, right alongside these demands for political payback. You got to face that disconnect head on.
Okay, makes sense. So let's give our listeners some concrete ways to actually do that. How do you highlight that tension effectively?
Well, you could start just by looking at the sequence, the timing. Remember, before the forgiveness part, Erica Kirk herself called for retribution on evildoers. She talked about her cries being like a battle cry.
A battle cry, then forgiveness? That's quite a rhetorical whiplash.
Exactly. How did people process that? Two totally different messages, basically back to back. That's a discussion right there.
And it wasn't just subtle, was it? Trump was pretty direct. You absolutely have to bring in his comments.
Oh, definitely. His explicit rebuttal, when he said, I hate my opponent and I don't want the best for them. I'm sorry, I am sorry, Erica. That line forces the issue. Was this about Christian healing or political warfare?
Yeah, you can't ignore that. So the guide should really push the discussion towards exploring how that tension maybe appealed to different groups. The faithful versus the political hard-right base. Who won that messaging battle?
And you can add depth by talking about sincerity. Bring in those reactions, especially from Christian communities online. Some pointed out, didn't they, that it felt like Jesus' message was being draped in an American flag.
Yeah.
That creates a really complicated picture. So yeah, focus on the conflict, not just the grace. Makes it way more interesting.
That whole tension, the theological versus the political, it really sets up the need for controlling the narrative afterwards, doesn't it? Which kind of begs a question, what happened if you didn't stick to the script?
Right. And that brings us neatly to the second point. The analysis of media reception must pivot from general discussion to the immediate political crackdown on dissenting speech.
Okay, so the current guide asks about media reception generally. Fox versus CNN, that kind of thing, which feels a bit standard.
Predictable, maybe. Where's the more insightful angle?
The real story, the complex part of the media fallout, wasn't just the different takes and coverage. It was the enforcement, the push to maintain one specific positive narrative. And that push involved disciplinary actions, threats. It became a real test of the conservative movement's own ideas about free speech. So it's not just what was said, but who got silenced.
Exactly. So the suggestion is a big shift. Move from what outlets reported to the documented consequences for people or platforms that stepped out of line. Criticizing Kirk, questioning the narrative.
That focus on consequences, that's the bigger picture. The forest, not the trees of individual news reports.
Right. When the guide talks about media, it should be asking about the political pressure used to keep everyone on message.
Okay, we need some solid, high-impact examples to show this.
You definitely need to bring in the New York Times framing, calling it a conservative version of the cancel culture. Or the woke right. Just using that term sparks debate.
And then get specific about the fallout.
Yes, the real-world consequences, like the Jimmy Kimmel Live suspension. That was huge. He questioned the narrative, and boom, indefinite suspension.
And it wasn't just about advertisers or social media pressure, was it? There were official threats, too.
Huge ones. You absolutely have to include FCC Chief Brendan Carr's comments, suggesting they could look at revoking broadcast licenses for a major network like ABC. That shows immense pressure to shut down anything that wasn't purely laudatory. Serious stuff.
And it wasn't just celebrities or big networks. This went broader.
Much broader. You should weave in the reports about teachers, military personnel, even Secret Service agents facing investigation or firing for saying things deemed critical of Kirk.
Wow.
And the key is to contrast that reality with the conservative movement's longstanding, very vocal defense of free speech. That apparent hypocrisy, that's the core of the media story here. That's what the discussion needs to grab onto.
Yeah, that contrast, free speech talk versus immediate silencing, elevates this way beyond just media studies. It's a political case study. Which actually leads us to the last layer, the language itself. Strengthen the analysis by contrasting the language of forgiveness with the surrounding rhetorical themes of martyrdom and war.
Right. The weakness currently is that the prompt zooms in on forgiveness and reconciliation, but it kind of ignores all the other language swirling around. Very militaristic language. Religious nationalist themes from other speakers.
And ignoring that language, does it just miss some flavor, or does it fundamentally misunderstand the purpose of the event?
I think it misunderstands the purpose. If you leave out the war talk, you miss how the event was explicitly used to mobilize the base, to frame things as an adversarial political war. It wasn't just a memorial. It felt like a rally, a call to arms.
Okay, so the suggestion here is to bring in discussion about political martyrdom as a strategy and how that connects to Christian nationalism, and specifically how that kind of war language makes actual reconciliation pretty much impossible.
Exactly. Martyrdom doesn't usually lead to peace talks, right? It tends to demand payback.
Okay, let's nail down some powerful examples of this war rhetoric that need to be in the discussion.
You have to analyze how often Charlie Kirk was called a martyr by people like J.D. Vance, Benny Johnson, Donald Trump Jr. That word choice isn't accidental. It reframes his death as a necessary sacrifice, part of a spiritual battle, turns tragedy into a political weapon.
And Stephen Miller's language was particularly stark, wasn't it?
Essential to include Miller, declaring the fire of Kirk supporters burns with a righteous fury, vowing to identify, disrupt, dismantle, and destroy progressive groups in Kirk's name. I mean, disrupt, dismantle, destroy? That's the opposite of forgiveness, isn't it?
Absolutely, polar opposite. The discussion has to grapple with how those two languages, forgiveness and destruction, were operating at the same time in the same space.
And you can even loop Erica Kirk's own broader narrative back into this.
How so?
And her organization's mission, saving the lost boys of the West, fighting sexual anarchy.
Mm-hmm.
You could argue that framing focusing on traditional gender roles, defining enemies like sexual anarchy, also fed into that polarized us versus them atmosphere. An atmosphere where maybe reconciliation rhetoric struggles to really land because the underlying framework is about defining boundaries and fighting enemies, not just extending grace.
Okay, this is really helpful. 3 clear, actionable ways to make this discussion guide much stronger, much more focused on the underlying dynamics.
Yeah, so first, directly tackle that tension. Forgiveness versus the immediate calls for political vengeance. Don't shy away from the clash. Second, shift the media analysis. Make it about the crackdown on dissent, the enforcement, not just who reported what.
And third, bring in the surrounding rhetoric. Analyze the language of martyrdom and spiritual war, and how that maybe undercut or reframe the message of reconciliation. Getting these elements in will make the final discussion way more robust, really hitting the most complex parts of this whole event.
Absolutely. So we encourage you to take these points, rework the discussion prompt, and feel free to send it back our way for another look. Really push into these complex themes. Until next time.